Jennifer Bleiker here, and I'd like to welcome you back to this month's Consent Building blog follow-up to our Consent Building Clinic number 72, titled, Don't Jump to Solutions, Protecting Your Public from Fatal Pitfalls. And in that clinic, we talked all about the tendency, whether it's in our professional or in our personal lives, of jumping to solutions. And you'll see it all over the place. Once you start to pay attention to it, you'll see public agencies doing it, you'll see the consultants helping write public policy, and you'll even find yourself doing it in your personal life. Now, we gave you, as we often do, a 16-step problem-solving and decision-making process diagram. And in that diagram, step 1 is define the problem and articulate the null alternatives. Now, the null alternative is that sequence of events that is likely to occur if the problem goes unaddressed. So it's not the worst case scenario, it's just what's the most realistic outcome if we don't address this problem. So that's step 1, generating solutions and going through the range of alternate solutions is step 10. So if you jump to step 10, you've missed 9 before, and the first one being the most important. Define the problem. You have to be very accurate when you define the problem, or at least do your best. Now, one version of jumping to solutions is defining the absence of a particular solution as a problem. And that's a serious mistake. I'll give you an example where a problem statement that says, the problem is that there's unregulated real estate development. This kind of problem is really jumping to the solution. After all, it locks it into the solution of regulate real estate development, and then the problem will be solved. Well, is it really a problem? And in our training, as we often do in all our consent building training, we encourage you to make sure that your projects adhere to the first and second law of public administration as we define it. The first law of public administration is any program or plan or proposal that doesn't address a serious problem or is perceived not to address a serious problem is living on borrowed time. It's only a matter of time before the public is going to annihilate that project. If you don't address a serious problem or are perceived not to, even if you are, if the public doesn't understand that you are addressing a serious problem, you're living on borrowed time. The second law of public administration is that any problem that doesn't address it won't affect someone's quality of life, whether how it is or ought to be or should be or could be, is also living on borrowed time. So you have to be sure that you are, 1, addressing a serious problem, and 2, that it will impact, by addressing this problem, you will positively impact someone's quality of life. And you have to define who that is and how it will impact that person or that group or that region's quality of life. In the example I just gave you of unregulated real estate development as being defined as a problem, it implies that the solution is regulating real estate. It would be the solution, but it doesn't speak to whose quality of life and how will it be impacted if this real estate continues to be unregulated. So it just completely bypasses that second law of public administration. And the problem statement doesn't even attempt to connect any problem to any person's or group's quality of life. It fails to answer whose quality of life is less than it ought to be, and in what specific ways. If the real estate continues to go unregulated. So it says nothing about how the implicit solution, regulating real estate, will somehow protect or enhance someone's quality of life. So that's an example of how we can all fall into the trap of just jumping into a solution, and where the solution implies a problem, or the absence of a solution implies, well, there must be a problem. So don't look just for cases where it's obvious that someone's jumping to a solution. Look for where it's less obvious, where it seems to be a good, honest to goodness problem-solving process, but where the solution is already implied, and then we're kind of locked into what the problem is and the range of solutions. So start with step one, define the problem and the null alternative, and make sure that they qualify under the first and second law of public administration. Here's a classical example from a very sophisticated government clientele who hired a very sophisticated consultant, Kaplan Associates, in the 60s, and had several federal agencies, DOT, HUD, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Department of Health and Human Services. They all got together and said, we have evolved to identify different regions of the country, and we define them sort of on our own. Why don't we hire this very sophisticated consultant to help us unify these regions so that we're all talking about the same region? When we talk about the Northwest or Region 1 or something, that we're all speaking about the same piece of land and the same demographics and the same populations falling within it. And it made sense to the consultants as well. They signed the contract, they accepted the mission, they said, absolutely, we can do that, that makes sense to us. And it wasn't until the consultants went around and started to interview different employees as well as stakeholders, public entities within those regions, to ask how they might better define the regions in a unified way so that the whole country was labeled in the same way, categorized in the same way. So they went around and they interviewed different cities and towns, tribes, industries, public agencies, as well as citizen groups and individuals. And what they found was that there were some major advantages of having these regions identified differently than other agencies. Because what would happen is that one community might apply for some funding through something like HUD or DOT, and if they were denied, they were allowed to reapply for similar funding from a different agency, provided it fell under a different region. So if all the regions had been unified, they would have just one shot at applying for some sort of funding or plan or program or grant. And if they failed to be awarded it, they weren't allowed to apply with another federal agency. And so it allowed for federal government to actually be more responsive to their publics by allowing them to fall into different regions and apply for funding or grants or whatever to different agencies without creating sort of a regional czar. That's what would have happened. And that was the conclusion of Kaplan Associates, is that this was actually very responsible governing. How it was, even though it evolved in this sort of clunky way where different regions are identified differently by different agencies, it actually had a lot of benefits. And so Kaplan Associates went back to the government clientele and said, look, this is not a problem. And although it looked like it on the surface, once we started with step one, we realized this isn't a problem and we better not address it. In fact, we will be reducing people's quality of life by creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. So that's one example we felt we had to share with you. And like I said, once you start to pay attention to the human tendency of identifying solutions before we really, really thoroughly identify the problem and the null alternative, and making sure that, number one, with public administration law number one, it's a serious problem. If it goes unchecked, serious repercussions will happen just looking at the null alternative. And public law of administration number two being that whose quality of life will be impacted and how. And it'll be less than it ought to be, could be, should be. So as long as what you're doing, what you're proposing, what you're working on, You've identified the problem. You've identified the no alternative, and it does meet the first and second law of public administration, then you're on pretty solid ground. Of course, you have to go through those other 15 steps of the problem-solving decision-making process that we have given you. But as long as you start there, and so far it's so good, just keep going. So we felt like we had to share that with you. We look forward to having you participate in next month's consent building clinic, number 73. And that's on, even though you can't take sides on an issue, you're not actually neutral either. And we'll get into the fine details of that. So again, we hope you